The click of a revolver hammer echoed through the parlor of the Hadley homestead, and Edith Hadley did not flinch. 6 men crowded her modest front room, dust and gun smoke clinging to their coats, the leader's pistol leveled at her chest. Outside, her cattle bawled in the corral where 2 more riders held torches high enough to set the barn ablaze at a single word. Edith stood behind her late husband's oak desk, her silver hair pulled back tight, her spine straight as a fence post, her hands folded before her like a woman awaiting nothing more than an afternoon caller. "You have exactly 1 minute, old woman," the leader said. His name was Silas Rourke, and he had ridden into the Wyoming territory 3 weeks prior with a reputation for burning out widows who refused to sign over their land. "Sign the deed, or we burn this place down around your ears and you can watch from the road." Edith's gaze did not waver from his. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice steady as a millstone, "you have made a grave miscalculation." He laughed low and ugly. "Is that so? You believe because I am 61 years old and because I buried my husband 2 winters back that I am helpless, that I have no cards to play." She reached slowly toward the desk drawer. 2 of his men raised their guns higher, but she only withdrew a folded paper, yellowed at the edges. "This is a letter from the Territorial Land Office. It states, quite plainly, that this parcel was surveyed incorrectly 40 years ago, and that the true boundary runs through the very ravine where your horses are currently tied." Rourke's brow furrowed. "What in blazes are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that you and your men are standing on federal land that does not belong to me, Mr. Rourke. It belongs to the Railroad Survey Company, who has been searching for trespassers just like you for the better part of a year, offering a reward for information leading to arrest." Edith allowed herself the faintest smile. "And I sent word to the marshal in Cheyenne 3 days ago, the very day your riders were first spotted watching my fence line." The color drained from Rourke's face as outside, the unmistakable thunder of approaching horses rose over the crackle of torch flame. Edith Hadley had not merely survived this confrontation. She had orchestrated it, every piece falling into place like a chess match played entirely inside her own steady mind, 3 weeks in the making. But to understand how a widow alone on the high plains had outthought 6 armed bandits, one had to go back to the beginning, to the spring when Edgar Kendrick had first ridden onto her land with doubt written plainly across his weathered face, certain that the old woman living alone at the edge of Larkspur Valley would not last the season. The spring of 1878 had come late to the Wyoming territory, and Edith Hadley had spent the better part of it repairing fence posts that the winter winds had knocked loose, working alone in the pale morning light with a hammer in one hand and a mouthful of nails clenched between her teeth. She was 61 years old, widowed 18 months, and she had buried more grief in that time than most women saw in a lifetime. Yet she rose every morning before the sun and worked until her hands blistered, because the alternative was to let the homestead her husband Thomas had built with his own 2 hands crumble into the prairie dust. It was on one such morning that Edgar Kendrick first rode up her lane, his black gelding kicking dust behind him, his hat pulled low against the wind. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard labor rather than idle boasting. He had been hired by the Regional Cattle Association to survey the smaller homesteads in the valley, checking fence lines and water rights, and word around town was that the widow Hadley's place was likely to fail before summer's end. "Morning, ma'am," he called out, reining his horse to a stop a respectful distance from where she worked. "Name's Edgar Kendrick. I am here on behalf of the Larkspur Cattle Association to look over your water rights and fencing." Edith did not look up immediately, finishing the nail she was driving with 3 efficient strikes of her hammer before she straightened and regarded him with the same unhurried assessment she gave everything. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, "I have heard your name mentioned at the mercantile. They say you are thorough." "I try to be, ma'am." "Good. Then you will not mind waiting while I finish this section of fence. The cattle do not care for association business, and neither, frankly, do I. Edgar felt a flicker of surprise at her directness, though he did not show it. He had expected, based on the talk in town, to find a frail and confused old woman clinging to a failing property out of stubbornness or grief. Instead, he found a woman with calloused hands and clear eyes who spoke to him as an equal, and who clearly had not asked his permission for anything in a very long time. He dismounted anyway and, without being asked, picked up a length of fence rail and held it steady while she nailed it into place. Edith glanced at him sideways, mildly surprised herself, but said nothing, and they worked in companionable silence for the better part of 20 minutes before she finally spoke again. "You are wondering why a widow my age is out here mending fences instead of hiring a man to do it for her. I confess the thought crossed my mind. The honest answer, Mr. Kendrick, is that I could hire someone. If I wish to spend money, I would rather save for the winter. I am not incapable simply because I have gray in my hair and no husband beside me." She hammered the final nail with a decisive strike. "My husband Thomas taught me everything about running this ranch before he passed, God rest him, from a fever that took him faster than either of us expected. I do not intend to let 2 years of grief undo 40 years of his teaching." Edgar studied her for a long moment, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. "No, ma'am, I do not suppose you would." They walked the property line together after that, and Edgar found himself increasingly impressed despite his initial skepticism. Edith knew the precise location of every water source on her 400 acres, could recite from memory the exact terms of the water-sharing agreement she had negotiated with the neighboring Callahan Ranch, and pointed out with unerring accuracy the places where her fence needed the most urgent repair before the summer cattle drives began. "You know this land better than most ranchers know their own," Edgar admitted as they paused near the ravine that marked the eastern boundary of her property. "I have had to know it, Mr. Kendrick. When my husband died, there were men in this valley who assumed I would sell out within the year, unable to manage alone. I intend to prove every one of them wrong, one season at a time." She looked at him then, something sharp and assessing in her gaze. "I suspect the association sent you here hoping to find grounds to declare my water rights forfeit, so that Rourke and men like him can purchase this parcel for pennies once I am forced to abandon it." Edgar's jaw tightened, because the accusation was not entirely unfounded, though he himself had no part in any such scheme. "I was sent to survey the land honestly, ma'am." "Nothing more. Then survey it honestly, and you will find that my water rights are ironclad, my fences are sound, and I have no intention of going anywhere." She turned and began walking back toward the house, leaving him standing at the ravine's edge with the distinct impression that he had just been thoroughly and politely put in his place. He returned to town that evening and found himself, against his own expectations, defending her capability to the men gathered at the saloon who spoke of the widow Hadley as though her homestead were already as good as abandoned. "She will not last through summer," said one man, a hired hand for the Callahan spread named Jasper Wren. "A woman alone out there, no sons, no husband. It is only a matter of time before someone takes that land off her hands, one way or another." "I would not wager against her," Edgar said quietly, surprising himself with the conviction in his own voice. "She knows that land better than any of us know our own mothers' faces." Jasper laughed, though there was an edge of unease beneath it. "You have gone soft on the old widow, Kendrick." Edgar did not respond, though the comment lingered with him longer than he cared to admit. He returned to the Hadley homestead twice more over the following weeks, ostensibly to complete his survey, though in truth he found himself drawn back by something he could not quite name, a curiosity about the woman who had so thoroughly upended his expectations. On his second visit he found Edith in her barn, examining a wagon wheel with the kind of focused intensity most men reserved for matters of life and death. "Trouble with the wheel?" he asked from the doorway. "The axle is warped," she said without looking up. "It happened during the last hard freeze. I have been meaning to repair it before I need the wagon for the spring supply run into town, but I have not yet found the time between the fencing and the cattle. I could take a look." Edith straightened and regarded him with the same measuring look she had given him during their first meeting. "You are spending a great deal of time at my homestead for a man conducting a simple boundary survey, Mr. Kendrick." Edgar felt heat rise up the back of his neck, though he kept his expression steady. "The association pays me by the week, ma'am, not the visit. I have time to spare." It was not entirely true, and something in Edith's expression suggested she knew it, though she said nothing further on the matter, only gestured toward the wagon and allowed him to help. They spent the better part of 2 hours working on the wheel together, and Edgar found himself once again struck by her competence, the sure and steady way she diagnosed the problem and directed the repair, never once deferring to him simply because he was younger or a man or both. "You did not always live out here alone," Edgar said as they worked, more a question than a statement. "No. Thomas and I built this place together 40 years past, when this valley was little more than open prairie and the nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away." Edith's hands paused on the wheel's iron rim, and for a moment something softer moved across her weathered features. "He was a good man. Not always an easy one, but a good one. We never had children who lived past infancy, which grieved us both terribly, though in time we came to see this land as the legacy we would leave instead. Every fence post, every well, every acre of grazing land, we built it together." "I am sorry for your loss," Edgar said, and meant it. "Thank you." Edith resumed her work on the wheel, her voice steadying. "Grief is a strange companion, Mr. Kendrick. It does not leave, not truly, but a person learns to work alongside it, the same as any other burden." Edgar found himself thinking about her words long after he had ridden back toward town that evening, the sun setting golden over the vast Wyoming plains. There was a depth to Edith Hadley that the gossips at the saloon could not begin to comprehend, a strength forged not in the absence of sorrow, but in the daily, deliberate choice to carry it without being crushed beneath its weight. It was nearly 3 weeks later, in the early days of what should have been an unremarkable summer, that the first signs of real trouble arrived in Larkspur Valley, and Edgar found himself once again riding toward the Hadley homestead, though this time the reason for his visit carried far greater urgency. Silas Rourke and his gang had been making their way steadily north through the territory for the better part of a year, leaving behind them a trail of burned-out homesteads and forced land sales that the local marshals had proven either unable or unwilling to stop. Rourke's method was simple and effective. He targeted isolated properties, particularly those belonging to widows or families without grown sons to defend them, and used threats and violence to force the owners into signing over their land at prices far below its true value, which he then sold to speculators eager to expand the railroad's reach through the valley. Edgar had heard whispers of Rourke's approach for weeks, riders passing through town with tales of burned barns and terrified families 3 counties over, and when he learned that Rourke's gang had been spotted just 20 miles south of Larkspur Valley, his first thought, unbidden and immediate, was of Edith Hadley alone on her homestead with no one to warn her of the danger bearing down. He found her in her garden, kneeling among rows of early vegetables, her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the morning chill. "Mrs. Hadley," he called as he dismounted, and something in his voice must have carried the weight of his urgency, because she rose immediately, brushing soil from her hands. "Mr. Kendrick, you look as though you have ridden hard. There is a gang moving through the territory, a man named Silas Rourke and 5 or 6 riders with him. They have been burning out homesteads further south, forcing widows and small ranchers to sign over their land." He paused, searching her face for the fear he expected to find there. "I came to warn you. I think you should consider staying in town until this passes, or at the very least, sending word to the marshal." But Edith's expression did not shift toward the panic Edgar had anticipated. Instead, something sharp and calculating moved behind her eyes, the same look she had given the warped wagon wheel weeks before, as though Rourke and his gang were simply another problem to be diagnosed and solved. How long before they reach the valley, do you think? A week, perhaps less if they continue at their current pace. Edith nodded slowly, already turning something over in her mind. And what do you know of Rourke's methods, specifically? How does he force these signatures? Threats, mostly. Burning barns, killing livestock. In 2 cases further south, I heard tell that he held family members at gunpoint until the deed was signed. And has anyone successfully resisted him? Edgar hesitated. Not that I have heard, ma'am. Most folks sign rather than risk their families or their homes. I see. Edith was quiet for a long moment, and Edgar watched with growing astonishment as her fear, if it existed at all, seemed to transform before his eyes into something closer to determination, even anticipation. Mr. Kendrick, I do not intend to sign anything, nor do I intend to flee my own home because of a common criminal with delusions of authority. Mrs. Hadley, with respect, this man has killed before. He is not someone to be trifled with. I am aware of that. Edith's voice remained calm, though there was steel beneath it now. Which is precisely why I do not intend to trifle with him. I intend to outthink him entirely. Edgar wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she leave the homestead in the care of the association and retreat to the relative safety of town, but something in her expression stopped him. A fierce and unshakable resolve that reminded him, oddly, of the way she had spoken of Thomas, and the 40 years they had spent building this place together. This was not merely land to Edith Hadley. It was the last remaining piece of a life she had loved, and Edgar understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that she would sooner die defending it than surrender it without a fight. "Then let me help you," he said, the words leaving him before he had fully considered them. "I know this territory and I know how to handle a rifle. You should not face this alone." Edith studied him for a long moment, and Edgar had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured in the same manner she had once assessed the warped wagon wheel, as though determining whether he was sound enough to be trusted with something important. "Very well, Mr. Kendrick," she said finally. "But I will tell you now, I do not intend to win this fight with rifles alone. Rourke has more men and more guns than I do. If we meet him with force, we lose. We must be smarter than he is, not stronger." "I am listening." And so, over the following days, Edith Hadley began to lay the groundwork for what would become the most audacious deception Larkspur Valley had ever witnessed. And Edgar Kendrick found himself swept into a plan so meticulously constructed that he began to understand, with each passing hour, precisely why the widow Hadley had never once considered herself helpless. The first piece of the plan required a visit to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, a full day's ride from the homestead. Edith insisted on making the journey herself, despite Edgar's offer to go in her stead. "I need to see the original survey documents with my own eyes," she explained as she prepared her horse for the journey. "Thomas mentioned once, years ago, that there had been some confusion during the original territorial survey about the exact boundary between our land and the federal parcel to the east. I need to know if that confusion was ever formally resolved, or if it remains a gap that we might use to our advantage. You believe there is an error in the survey?" "I believe there is a possibility, Mr. Kendrick, and possibilities, when properly understood and deployed, can be more powerful than any rifle." She swung up into the saddle with the ease of a woman half her age, and Edgar felt that now familiar jolt of surprise at her capability. "I intend to find out for certain." She returned 2 days later with a satisfied look on her face and a folded document tucked carefully into her saddlebag. "The original survey from 1839 was indeed flawed," she reported to Edgar, who had been anxiously awaiting her return, uncertain whether to be relieved that she had come back safely or impressed by what she had accomplished. "The boundary between my property and the federal land grant to the east was never properly resurveyed after the territory was formally organized. On paper, at least, There is a genuine ambiguity about exactly where my land ends and federal property begins, and that ambiguity happens to fall precisely along the ravine that marks my eastern fence line. How does that help us against Rourke? Edith's eyes glinted with something Edgar could only describe as pure strategic delight. Because, Mr. Kendrick, if Rourke and his men make camp anywhere near that ravine, as bandits typically do, seeking the shelter of low ground and tree cover, they will very likely be trespassing on land the federal government considers its own, land that the Railroad Survey Company has been actively investigating for illegal grazing and timber theft for the better part of a year. I learned as much from the clerk in Cheyenne, who mentioned that the survey company has posted a reward for information leading to the arrest of trespassers in that very area. Edgar stared at her, slowly beginning to comprehend the shape of the trap she was constructing. You intend to lure them onto that land. I intend to make certain that when Rourke arrives to threaten me, he does so standing on ground that is not mine to surrender, land that comes with federal marshals already primed to investigate any activity there. All I need to do is ensure that the marshal's office is watching at precisely the right moment. Over the following days, Edith's plan grew more intricate. She sent a carefully worded letter to the marshal's office in Cheyenne, describing suspicious activity near the ravine and requesting that a deputy be dispatched to investigate reports of trespassing and illegal timber cutting, timing the request so that a response would likely arrive within the same window that Rourke's gang was expected to reach the valley. She also began quietly moving her most valuable possessions and a portion of her cattle to the Callahan Ranch for safekeeping, under the cover of a supposed visit to a sick relative, so that Rourke would find less to threaten when he arrived. Edgar, for his part, spent those days learning more about Edith Hadley than he had learned about any person in years. He discovered that she had taught herself to read legal documents after Thomas's death specifically, so that no one could take advantage of her ignorance in matters of land and contract law. He discovered that she kept detailed ledgers of every transaction on the homestead, going back decades, organized with a precision that would have impressed the most meticulous banker. He discovered, too, that beneath her formidable competence lay a well of loneliness she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, a longing for companionship that had gone unmet since Thomas's passing. "Do you ever think of remarrying?" Edgar asked one evening as they sat on her porch reviewing the details of the plan by lantern light, the question escaping him before he had fully considered its implications. Edith looked up from her papers, mild surprise crossing her features. "That is a rather personal question, Mr. Kendrick. Forgive me, I did not mean to overstep." "No, it is a fair question, I suppose." She set down her pen and gazed out over the darkened prairie for a long moment. "I loved Thomas very much, and for many years after his passing, I could not imagine wanting anything other than to preserve what we built together. But I confess that in recent weeks, I have found myself less certain of that conviction than I once was." Something in her tone made Edgar's pulse quicken, though he told himself it was merely curiosity. "What has changed?" Edith met his gaze directly, and there was a vulnerability there that he had not seen in her before, quite different from the sharp, calculating woman who had spent the past week outmaneuvering bandits on paper. "I have had a rather unexpected reminder, Mr. Kendrick, that there are still men in this world who value a woman's mind as much as her hands, who do not flinch when she proves capable rather than helpless. It is a rare thing, and I find I had forgotten how much I missed it." Edgar did not trust himself to respond immediately, aware of the sudden thickness in his throat, the way his chest had tightened at her words. He was 34 years old and had told himself for years that he had no particular need for a wife, that his work kept him satisfied and his solitude suited him well enough. But sitting on that porch in the lantern light, watching Edith Hadley's weathered face soften with an honesty she rarely permitted herself, he felt something shift inside him that he could not easily name. "I have not known many women like you, Mrs. "Hadley," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Most folks in this territory, when they hear a woman lives alone, assume she must be desperate or foolish or both. I confess I made that same assumption myself, the day I first rode up your lane. And now I think I have never met anyone, man or woman, who thinks as clearly or fights as fiercely for what matters to them." He paused, searching for the right words, aware that he was treading into territory far more dangerous than any negotiation with bandits. "I think, if I am honest, that I have come to admire you a great deal more than my original assignment ever required." Edith's expression softened further, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with something unspoken but unmistakably present. Then, practical as ever, she cleared her throat and returned her attention to the papers before her. "We have a great deal of work left to do before work arrives, Mr. Kendrick. Sentiment will have to wait until the homestead is secure." But Edgar noticed, as they continued their planning long into the night, that she sat a little closer to him than strictly necessary, and that when their hands brushed while reviewing the survey documents, she did not pull away as quickly as she might have. The days that followed passed in a blur of careful preparation. Edith sent word through a trusted writer to the Callahan Ranch, arranging for their assistance should the plan require additional support, and Edgar rode the perimeter of the property each evening, watching for any sign of Rourke's approach. They rehearsed every contingency, every possible way the confrontation might unfold, Edith insisting on precision in every detail. "Rourke is not a stupid man," she explained, "merely a cruel and greedy one. If we underestimate him, we will fail. We must assume he will look for weaknesses in our plan, and we must close every one of them before he arrives." It was during one of these long evenings of preparation that Edgar found himself watching her with something beyond mere admiration, a feeling that had been building steadily since their first meeting weeks before, and had now grown into something he could no longer easily dismiss. She caught him watching, and rather than looking away, held his gaze with the same steady confidence she brought to everything else. "You are staring, Mr. Kendrick. I apologize. I was simply thinking that I have never met anyone quite like you, Mrs. Hadley, and I find myself uncertain what to do with that realization." Edith's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps, Mr. Kendrick, you might simply allow yourself to feel whatever it is you are feeling, rather than analyzing it to death. I have found, in my experience, that the heart rarely benefits from overthinking. That seems remarkably unlike your usual approach to problems." "The heart," Edith said softly, "is not a problem to be solved. It is simply a truth to be acknowledged." She reached across the small distance between them and rested her weathered hand briefly atop his. "I have spent a great deal of time these past weeks reminding myself why I chose to fight for this land rather than surrender it. I find that you, Mr. Kendrick, have become rather unexpectedly entangled in that reasoning." Edgar's heart pounded against his ribs, and he found himself leaning slightly closer, though propriety and the seriousness of their circumstances kept him from closing the distance entirely. "Mrs. Hadley, I think I have come to care for you a great deal more than I anticipated when I first rode onto your land." "I think," Edith said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I have come to feel the same, Mr. Kendrick, though I confess it terrifies me somewhat to admit it." "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I buried one great love already, and I am no longer young. I do not know how many years I have left to give, and it seems a cruel thing to ask a man in the prime of his life to tether himself to a woman who has already lived the greater portion of hers." Edgar shook his head firmly, taking her weathered hand fully in his own. "I do not measure the worth of a person by the years remaining to them, Mrs. Hadley. I measure it by the strength of their character, the sharpness of their mind, and the fierceness with which they love what matters to them. By every one of those measures, you are worth more than any woman I have ever known, regardless of age." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Edith's eyes, though she blinked them back with the same discipline she brought to every challenge. "You are a good man, Edgar Kendrick. I did not expect, when you first rode up my lane weeks ago, that I would come to feel this way about anyone again." "Nor did I," Edgar admitted, "but I find that I am glad of it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the weight of the coming confrontation with Rourke pressing against the fragile new tenderness blooming between them. And Edgar found himself praying, with an intensity he had not felt in years, that they would both survive what was coming, so that whatever this was between them might have the chance to grow into something lasting. Word reached them 3 days later that Rourke's gang had been spotted just 8 miles south of the valley, moving steadily toward the Hadley homestead with clear intent. Edith received the news with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout their preparations, though Edgar noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that betrayed the gravity of what they now faced. "It is time," she said simply. "Send word to the Callahan ranch that we may need their assistance within the day, and ride to the marshal's outpost to confirm that the deputy has indeed been dispatched to investigate the ravine, as I requested. I will remain here and ensure that everything appears precisely as it should when Rourke arrives." "I do not like leaving you here alone, even briefly," Edgar said, the protective instinct that had been growing in him for weeks now sharp and insistent. "I will not truly be alone, Mr. Kendrick. I have my late husband's rifle, which I know how to use, and I have the element of surprise on my side. Rourke expects to find a frightened old woman he can bully into submission. He has no notion of what he is actually walking into." Edith's expression firmed with resolve. "Trust me to handle myself until you return. I have managed this homestead alone for 18 months. I am not without resources." Edgar hesitated, torn between his instinct to remain by her side and his understanding that the plan required him elsewhere, coordinating the pieces that would ultimately spring the trap they had so carefully constructed. Finally, he nodded, though reluctance remained evident in every line of his broad frame. "I will return as quickly as I am able. Do not take any unnecessary risks before I am back." "I make no promises, Mr. Kendrick, except that I intend to still be standing when you return." She allowed herself a brief, uncharacteristic moment of tenderness, reaching up to press her palm against his weathered cheek. "Ride safely." Edgar departed within the hour, his gelding kicking up dust as he raced first toward the Callahan ranch, and then onward to the marshal's outpost at the edge of the valley, his mind consumed with worry for the woman he had left behind, and admiration for the calm, unshakable courage with which she faced the danger bearing down upon her. It was 2 days later, in the golden light of a Wyoming morning that gave no hint of the violence to come, that Silas Rourke and his 6 riders finally reached the Hadley homestead, exactly as Edith had anticipated. She had spent the intervening time completing the final preparations of her plan, moving with the same methodical precision she brought to every task, and when Rourke's men rode into her yard with torches already lit and pistols drawn, she was ready. This brought the story full circle to the confrontation that had begun this telling, the moment when Edith Hadley stood alone behind her husband's oak desk, facing down 6 armed bandits with nothing but her wits and the meticulously constructed trap she had spent weeks assembling. Rourke's face had drained of color as the thunder of approaching horses grew louder outside, and Edith allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied smile. "You will find, Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the growing commotion outside, "that the deputy marshal riding toward us at this very moment has been investigating suspicious activity near that ravine for the better part of a week. Illegal timber cutting, unauthorized grazing, and now, I suspect, armed trespassing with clear criminal intent. I imagine the reward for your capture alone will be quite substantial." "You are lying," Rourke snarled, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Am I?" Edith reached again into the desk drawer, this time withdrawing a second document, which she unfolded with deliberate slowness. "This is a copy of the reward notice posted by the Union Pacific Survey Company, offering $200 for information, leading to the arrest of trespassers operating in this territory. I sent a detailed report to the marshal's office in Cheyenne nearly a week ago, describing your gang's activities in precise detail, including the approximate location where I expected you to make camp before approaching my property. Rourke's men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado rapidly evaporating as the sound of approaching riders grew undeniable, several sets of hooves now clearly audible over the crackle of the torches they still held. "You could not have known we would camp near that ravine," Rourke insisted, though his pistol had begun to waver. "Bandits always seek the shelter of low ground and tree cover when making camp near a target, Mr. Rourke. It is a pattern as predictable as sunrise. I have lived on this land for 40 years. I know every ravine, every stand of trees, every place a man might hide while watching a homestead for the right moment to strike. There was truly only one location suitable for your purposes, and I made certain the marshal's office was watching it closely." The riders burst into the yard at that moment, 6 deputies with rifles drawn, led by a stern-faced marshal named Cassius Boone who had ridden hard from Cheyenne at Edith's request, timed to arrive at precisely this moment based on her careful calculation of Rourke's likely travel speed. Behind them, unmistakable and welcome, rode Edgar Kendrick, his own rifle raised, having returned from the Callahan Ranch with 3 additional armed men just in time to reinforce the marshal's arrival. "Drop your weapons," Marshal Boone commanded, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "You are all under arrest for trespassing on federal survey land, illegal timber cutting, and attempted armed extortion." Rourke's men, seeing themselves surrounded and outnumbered, began lowering their weapons almost immediately, their earlier confidence entirely dissolved. Rourke himself hesitated, his pistol still leveled at Edith, a last desperate flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You think a piece of paper and some clever timing will save you, old woman. I could still put a bullet in you before they reach the door." "You could," Edith agreed, her voice remarkably steady despite the pistol pointed directly at her chest. "But I suspect you have calculated correctly that doing so would guarantee your own death within moments, whereas surrendering now offers at least the possibility of a trial and eventual freedom, however many years distant. You are a cruel man, Mr. Rourke, but you have proven, in every homestead you have burned and every widow you have threatened, that you are also fundamentally a coward who prefers easy targets to genuine risk. I do not believe you have the stomach to trade your own life for a moment's satisfaction." For a long, tense moment, the outcome hung uncertain in the morning air, Rourke's pistol trembling slightly as some internal calculation played out behind his eyes. Then, with a curse, he lowered his weapon and let it fall to the floor, defeat settling over his features as the deputies moved in to restrain him. Edgar was through the door within seconds, his rifle lowered the moment he confirmed Edith was unharmed, crossing the room in 3 long strides to pull her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of the fear he had carried throughout his ride back to the homestead. "You are unharmed," he said, his voice rough with relief, his arms tightening around her. "I am quite unharmed, Mr. Kendrick, though I confess I am glad to see you." Edith allowed herself to rest against him for a long moment, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion she had not permitted herself to feel while Rourke's pistol was still pointed at her chest. Marshal Boone approached once the prisoners had been secured, removing his hat respectfully as he addressed Edith. "Mrs. Hadley, I have been chasing this gang for the better part of 6 months without success. Your letter provided exactly the evidence and timing we needed to finally bring them to justice. I do not know how you managed to predict their movements with such precision, but the territory owes you a considerable debt." "I simply understood the land better than they did, Marshal," Edith replied, though the ghost of a satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth. "And I understood, perhaps better than most, that men who prey on those they assume to be weak rarely account for the possibility that their assumptions might be entirely wrong. The marshal chuckled, shaking his head with evident admiration. "Well, ma'am, I believe you have proven that assumption spectacularly incorrect. The reward for Rourke's capture will be considerable, and I intend to see that you receive the full amount, given that your intelligence made this arrest possible." As the deputies led Rourke and his men away toward the wagon that would transport them to the territorial prison in Cheyenne, Edith and Edgar remained standing together in the yard, the morning sun climbing higher over the Wyoming plains, the immediate danger finally, truly past. "You never once doubted your plan would work," Edgar said, still holding her close, marveling at the woman in his arms who had just outmaneuvered 6 armed bandits through nothing more than her intellect and her intimate knowledge of the land she had spent 40 years learning to love. "I doubted a great many things over these past weeks, Mr. Kendrick," Edith admitted, her earlier composure finally giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. "I doubted whether the marshal would arrive in time. I doubted whether Rourke would truly camp where I predicted. But I never doubted my own capability to think my way through this, because I have spent 18 months proving to myself, if to no one else, that I am not the helpless widow this valley assumed me to be." "No one who knows you now could ever make that assumption again," Edgar said, and there was something in his voice, some deep well of emotion that had been building for weeks, finally breaking free. "Edith, I have admired capable people throughout my life, but I have never in my 34 years witnessed anything like what you accomplished today. You did not simply survive this threat. You transformed it into your own weapon, using nothing but your mind and your knowledge of this land. I am, quite simply, in awe of you." Edith looked up at him, her weathered face open in a way Edgar had rarely seen, the careful composure she maintained for the world entirely absent in this private moment between them. "I could not have managed the timing without you, Edgar. You rode for the marshal, you gathered the Callahan men, you trusted my plan even when it must have seemed impossibly risky to stake everything on a boundary dispute 40 years old. This victory belongs to both of us." "Perhaps," Edgar allowed, "but the mind behind it was entirely your own, and I find that I am falling in love with that mind, Edith Hadley, as thoroughly as I have fallen in love with everything else about you." The words hung in the morning air between them, finally spoken aloud after weeks of careful circling, and Edith felt something long dormant within her chest bloom fully back to life, a warmth she had thought buried alongside Thomas nearly 2 years before. "I love you as well, Edgar Kendrick," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now gathering in her eyes. "I did not expect at my age, with my life already so fully lived, to find this kind of feeling again. But you have shown me, these past weeks, that love does not measure itself by the years remaining, only by the depth of understanding between two people. You saw me clearly from nearly the very beginning, when the rest of this valley saw only an old woman they assumed could not manage alone." Edgar lowered his head then and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing certainty, there in the yard where bandits had so recently threatened everything she held dear, the morning sun bathing them both in golden light as the last of the deputies rode away with their prisoners in tow. When they finally parted, Edith rested her forehead against his chest, and Edgar wrapped his arms fully around her, both of them silent for a long moment, simply absorbing the reality that they had not only survived this ordeal but had found, in the midst of it, something neither had expected to discover again. News of Edith Hadley's triumph over Rourke's gang spread through Larkspur Valley within days, carried by the deputies and the marshal himself, who spoke with evident admiration of the widow's cunning and courage to anyone who would listen. The same men who had once gathered at the saloon predicting her homestead's inevitable failure now spoke her name with a very different tone, one of respect bordering on genuine awe. Jasper Wren, the hired hand who had so confidently predicted her downfall months before, found himself eating his words rather publicly one evening at the saloon, when a fellow rancher recounted the tale of how the widow had used a 40-year-old survey error to trap 6 armed bandits into the arms of federal marshals. "I told you," Edgar said, unable to resist a small measure of satisfaction as he stood nearby, having ridden into town to purchase supplies, "that I would not wager against her." "You were right, Kendrick, and I was a fool to doubt her," Jasper admitted, shaking his head with something like admiration. "That woman has more sense in her little finger than most men in this territory carry in their whole bodies." Edgar could not help the smile that spread across his face, pride swelling in his chest at hearing Edith's capability, finally recognized by those who had once dismissed her so readily. He purchased his supplies and rode back toward the homestead, eager to share the valley's changing opinion with the woman who had earned it through nothing but her own resourcefulness and courage. He found Edith in her garden once again, tending to the vegetables that had continued growing steadily throughout the crisis, as though the natural rhythms of the homestead had refused to be disrupted even by the threat of violence that had so recently passed through it. "The whole valley speaks of nothing else," Edgar told her as he dismounted, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Jasper Wren himself admitted you have more sense than most men in this territory combined." Edith laughed, a warm and genuine sound that Edgar had come to treasure over their weeks together, so different from the careful composure she had shown the world before he had earned her trust. "I suppose I should feel some satisfaction in that, though I confess I care rather less for the valley's opinion now than I once might have." "No. What has changed your priorities, Mrs. Hadley?" She rose from where she had been kneeling among the vegetables, brushing soil from her hands with practiced efficiency before closing the distance between them. "I have found something rather more valuable than the good opinion of gossiping neighbors, Mr. Kendrick. I have found a partnership built on genuine respect, the kind of understanding I once thought I could only ever know with Thomas. I find that I care far more about preserving that than about proving myself to anyone else." Edgar reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a tenderness that had become natural between them over the preceding weeks. "I would like very much, Edith, to discuss what that partnership might look like, moving forward. I do not wish to return to my work with the association and leave you here alone, not when I have come to feel about you as deeply as I do." Edith's eyes searched his face for a long moment, and Edgar could see her weighing the question with the same careful consideration she brought to every significant decision, though there was warmth beneath the calculation now, an openness that had not existed when they first met. "Are you asking me to consider marriage, Edgar Kendrick?" "I am asking exactly that, though I confess I have never proposed to anyone before, and I fear I am making rather a poor job of it, standing here in your garden with dirt still on your hands and no ring to offer." Edith's laugh rang out again, bright and unguarded. "I do not require a ring or a rehearsed speech, Edgar. I require only honesty and a partner who will respect my capability rather than seeking to diminish it, who will stand beside me rather than in front of me, treating me as an equal in every decision that affects our shared life. I can promise you that, without reservation. I have spent these past weeks learning that your mind is sharper than any I have encountered, your courage more genuine than any I have witnessed. I do not wish to diminish that. I wish to build a life alongside it, where your strength and mine might combine into something neither of us could achieve alone." Edith was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting briefly toward the house where she had built 40 years of memories with Thomas, before returning to settle fully on Edgar's face. "Then yes, Edgar Kendrick. I will marry you, and gladly, though I insist that our partnership be built on the same equality we have shown each other these past weeks. I do not intend to become simply a wife who defers to her husband's judgment. I intend to remain exactly who I am, capable and independent, with my own voice in every matter that concerns this homestead and our life together." "I would not have it any other way," Edgar said, and sealed the promise with a kiss that spoke of both passion and profound respect. there among the vegetables she had tended with such quiet determination throughout the crisis that had brought them together. They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony held on the homestead itself, beneath the same oak tree where Thomas had once proposed to Edith some 42 years before, a detail she shared with Edgar in the days leading up to the wedding, wanting him to understand that she carried her past with her, not as a burden, but as a foundation upon which this new chapter of her life could be built. "I do not ask you to replace what I had with Thomas," she told him the evening before their wedding, as they sat together on the porch where so much of their courtship had unfolded. "I ask only that you allow me to love you fully, in the particular way that this second chapter of my life requires, different from the first but no less genuine. I would never ask you to forget him, Edith. He built this land with you, and his memory lives in every fence post and every acre we will continue to tend together. I am honored to build something new alongside what you already created with him." The wedding itself was a modest affair, attended by the Callahan family, several other neighboring ranchers who had come to respect Edith over the preceding weeks, and even Marshall Boone, who rode from Cheyenne specifically to witness the union of the woman whose intelligence had finally brought Rourke's gang to justice. Jasper Wren attended as well, having become, somewhat unexpectedly, one of Edith's most vocal admirers in the months following her confrontation with the bandits. Edith wore a simple dress of pale blue, her silver hair adorned with wildflowers gathered from the very prairie that had sustained her through decades of both joy and hardship. And when she walked toward Edgar beneath the spreading branches of the old oak tree, he found himself struck once again by the remarkable strength and grace that had first captured his attention months before, now combined with a softness and joy he had not seen in her during those early, more guarded weeks of their acquaintance. "I, Edith Hadley, take you, Edgar Kendrick, as my husband," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes, "not as a replacement for what I have lost, but as a partner for what remains to be built. I promise to bring to this marriage the same fierce dedication I have brought to every challenge this land has presented me, and I trust you to meet that dedication with equal partnership and respect. I, Edgar Kendrick, take you, Edith Hadley, as my wife," Edgar replied, his own voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide, "having witnessed firsthand the extraordinary strength of your mind and the depth of your courage. I promise to stand beside you always, never in front of you, respecting your judgment as I respect my own, and cherishing the remarkable woman you have shown yourself to be in every season of our life together." Their first kiss as husband and wife drew warm applause from the small gathering, and as the celebration continued into the golden hours of the afternoon, Edith found herself surrounded by a community that had transformed, over the course of a single dramatic confrontation, from doubters into admirers, and finally into genuine friends who recognized in her something worth celebrating rather than pitying. The years that followed brought their own share of challenges, as life on the frontier always did, but Edith and Edgar faced each one together, their partnership built on the foundation of mutual respect that had defined their courtship from its earliest days. Edgar resigned his position with the Cattle Association within the year, choosing instead to devote himself fully to the Hadley homestead, which he insisted on continuing to call by that name even after their marriage, understanding the deep significance the land held for the woman he loved. Together they expanded the ranch considerably over the following decade. Edith's meticulous record-keeping and shrewd understanding of land and water rights combining with Edgar's physical strength and tireless work ethic to build something even more prosperous than either had managed alone. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated bountiful harvests and successful cattle drives, and gradually became known throughout the territory not merely as survivors of Rourke's attempted extortion, but as one of the most respected and successful ranching partnerships in the entire valley. 3 years into their marriage, when Edith was 64 years old, She surprised both herself and Edgar with the unexpected news that she was carrying a child, a development neither had anticipated given her age, but one that filled them both with a joy neither had thought possible at this stage of their lives. The pregnancy proceeded with the same careful attention Edith brought to everything else, and she gave birth, with considerable difficulty but ultimate success, to a healthy son they named Thomas, in honor of the husband whose memory Edith continued to hold with love and gratitude even as she built this new chapter of her life with Edgar. "He has your eyes," Edith murmured as she held their newborn son for the first time, exhaustion and joy mingling on her weathered features. "But I suspect, given the stubborn set of his jaw already, that he will have your determination as well." "I hope he inherits your mind above all else," Edgar replied, gazing down at his wife and their unexpected miracle with an expression of profound tenderness. "The world could use more people who think as clearly and fight as fiercely for what matters as you do, Edith." Young Thomas Kendrick grew up on the homestead his mother had defended so brilliantly. Raised on stories of the bandits she had outwitted through nothing but her intelligence and her intimate knowledge of the land. Tales that grew into something of a local legend throughout Larkspur Valley as the years passed. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Edith and Edgar welcomed a second child, a daughter they named Margaret, after Edith's own mother, and the family that had begun with such unlikely circumstances continued to grow and flourish in the years that followed. Edith lived to see both her children grown, to see the homestead she had fought so fiercely to protect passed down through another generation, and to witness, with quiet satisfaction, the transformation of Larkspur Valley from a place where widows were assumed helpless into a community that had learned, through her example, to judge capability by demonstrated strength rather than by age or gender or circumstance. She and Edgar remained devoted partners for the remainder of their lives, their marriage deepening over the decades into the kind of profound companionship that comes only from years of mutual respect and shared struggle and joy. Edgar never once forgot the moment he had first ridden onto her land, certain he would find a helpless old woman clinging to a failing homestead. Nor did he forget the profound shock and admiration he had felt as he watched her methodically outmaneuver 6 armed bandits through nothing more than her formidable intelligence and unshakable courage. "I fell in love with you that very first day," he confessed to her once, many years into their marriage, as they sat together on the same porch where their courtship had first blossomed, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where Rourke's gang had once threatened everything Edith held dear. "I simply did not have sense enough to recognize it until you had already outwitted 6 bandits and proven beyond any doubt that you needed no one to rescue you." "I did not need rescuing," Edith agreed, resting her head against his shoulder with the ease of decades of shared affection. "But I am endlessly grateful nonetheless that you chose to stand beside me anyway, not out of necessity, but out of genuine partnership and love." "I would choose it again, every single time, in every lifetime we might be given," Edgar replied, and pressed a tender kiss to her silver hair, now considerably grayer than it had been on that first fateful spring morning when he had ridden up her lane, so certain of what he would find and so thoroughly, wonderfully mistaken. The homestead that Edith Hadley had defended so brilliantly against Silas Rourke's gang continued to thrive for generations, passed down eventually to Thomas and Margaret, and their own children, the story of the widow who had outsmarted the bandits becoming a cherished piece of family history, told and retold at gatherings for decades to come. It stood as a testament not merely to Edith's remarkable intelligence and courage, but to the profound truth she had embodied throughout her long and eventful life. That strength took many forms, that capability could not be measured by age or circumstance alone, and that the deepest and most enduring love often grew not from rescue or dependence, but from mutual respect between two people who recognized, clearly and completely, the full measure of each other's worth. Edith Hadley passed from this world many years later, in the same bed where she had raised her children, surrounded by 3 generations of family who had learned from her example that resilience and intelligence could overcome any obstacle life presented. Edgar remained by her side until her final breath, his hand clasped in hers just as it had been on so many evenings throughout their long and happy marriage. And though his grief in the years that followed was profound, he found solace in the knowledge that they had built something lasting together, a legacy of love and partnership that would endure long after both of them had passed from the land they had cherished so deeply. The valley remembered her always as the widow who had refused to be underestimated, who had transformed doubt into respect through nothing more than the sharpness of her mind and the depth of her courage, and whose love story with Edgar Kendrick stood as proof that the heart's capacity for connection did not diminish with age, but rather deepened with the wisdom that only a life fully lived could provide.